bought new books, right? Just wanted to show them off right quick. This one is the Godless Constitution and the Providential Republic by Stephen Smith. Looks like this. And what is this about? Like it says here in the flap. This is in this timely and well-researched book. Law scholar Stephen D. Smith makes the case that the United States of America was founded on a providentialist view. The belief that God actively directs the destinies not only of individuals but of nations. Smith shows how this providentialist perspective was pervasively, officially, and unapologetically expressed in the essential public documents like the Declaration of Independence and by presidents from Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Lincoln to modern presidents including FDR, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Obama. A crucial point in Smith's argument is that the Constitution neither prescribed nor forbade this providentialist understanding. It was like an agnostic parent who allowed their children the freedom of to follow a religious or non-religious path as they wished. In modern times, by contrast, the courts and the legal and academic communities have frequently misinterpreted the Constitution as mandating governance that is completely secular. In so doing, they have effectively banished the providentialist perspective from American public philosophy. The consequences of this banishment have been deeply disruptive, contributing to dangerous polarization and lack of trust in government and other public institutions. Smith's compelling study is an essential resource for making sense of current debates about the place of religion in American public life. The readers will gain a deeper understanding of the extent to which secular neutrality is not mandated by the Constitution, but rather is a modern invention with little grounding in the nation's history. So it's interesting. Yeah, I guess it just goes over to providentialist views and stuff like that. And then, let me see, put this over here. I did find this book on Amazon, right? It's called In Defense of Christian Nations. The Bible, Natural Affections, and God's Plan to Use Nations for Good by Michael L. Belch. Looks like this. This is a soft cover. It's nice, my nice little cover. Look in the back, it says, A Christian Vision for Nations. Europe didn't invent nations in 1648. They aren't a modern innovation. God established them in Genesis 10 as the primary sphere for humanity to fulfill its two great purposes, making dominion of the earth and taking dominion of the earth and doing spiritual good. In fact, nations are essential for man's fruitfulness and faithfulness. Yet today, the very idea of a nation is under attack, both outside and within the church, as globalism, multiculturalism, and pietism undermine God's created order. Churches in the West have lost the vision for loving and prioritizing the nations God has placed them in. For this reason, nations have become secular, pagan, and borderless. But Christ rules over all nations and commands his people to disciple them into the name of the triune God, in short. He calls the nations to be Christian. So obviously it's written by Trinitarian, but overall, like I was looking at it, it seems like he agrees with like a little bit from people like Webb and Stephen Wolf, but he also has disagreements. Like, probably read from it later. I just wanted to show it off for now. What else? This one is it's called Keeping the Republic: A Defense of American Constitutionalism. So this is by Dennis Hale and Mark Landy. I think it's responding to things like what was it called? 1619 Project or something like that. What this says. Like here in the flap, the book's about says keeping the republic. A republic is an eloquent defense of the American constitutional order and a response to its critics, including those who are estranged from the very idea of a fixed constitution, in which, quote, the living are governed by the dead, end quote. And Dennis Hale and Mark Landy take seriously the criticisms of the United States Constitution before mounting their argument. They present an intellectual history of their key critics, including Thomas Paine, William Lloyd Garrison, Henry David Thoreau, Woodrow Wilson, Robert Dahl, Sanford Levinson, and the authors of the 1619 Project. Why, they ask, if the constitutional order is so well designed, so many American citizens have a negative view of the American political order. To address that question, they examine the most crucial episodes in American political development, from the founding to the present. Hale and Landy frame their defense of the Constitution by understanding America in terms of modernity, where small republics are no longer possible, and there is a need to protect the citizens of a mass modern state while still preserving liberty. The Constitution makes large popular government possible by placing. It continues on the other flap. By placing effective limits on the exercise of power. The Constitution forces the people to be governed by the dead, both to pay the debt we owe to those who came before us and to preserve society for generations yet unborn. Hale and Landy offer both a survey of American anti-constitutionalism and a powerful argument for maintaining the constitutional order of the nation's framers. So basically addresses the critics, right? And away from the computer. This one, I thought this one is called Father of Liberty, Jonathan Mayhew and the Principles of the American Revolution. This is by J. Patrick Mullins. Let me see. This book is about, this is Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, 1720 through 1766, was, according to John Adams, a, quote, transcendental genius who threw all the weight of his great fame into the scale of the country in 1761 and maintained it there with zeal and ardor till his death, end quote. He was also J. Patrick Mullins contends, the most politically influential clergyman in 18th century America and the intellectual progenitor of the American Revolution in New England. Father of Liberty is the first book to fully explore Mayhew's political thought and activism, understood within the context of his personal experiences, intellectual influences, and the cultural developments and political events of his time. Analyzing and assessing his contributions to 18th century New England political culture, the book demonstrates Mayhew's critical contribution to the intellectual origins of the American Revolution. As pastor of the Congregationalist West Church in Boston, Mayhew championed the principles of natural rights, constitutionalism, and resistance to tyranny in press and pulpit from 1750 to 1766. He did more than any clergyman to prepare New England for disobedience to British authority in the 1760s, and should, Mullins argues, be counted alongside such framers and forementers of revolutionary thought as James Otis, Patrick Henry, and Samuel Adams. Though many commentators from John Adams on down have acknowledged his importance as a popularizer of Whig political principles, Father of Liberty is the first extended, in-depth examination of Mayhew's political writings, as well as the cultural process by which he engaged with the public and disseminated those principles. As such, even as the book restores a key figure to his place in American intellectual and political history. It illuminates the meaning of the Revolution as a political and constitutional conflict informed by the religious and political ideas of British Enlightenment. That's what it looks like. This one says, this one's Locke, Science and Politics by Stephen Ford. Has Locke on the cover. It's another book I found. It talks about, I think it was saying something about like, to his liberalism you need like God, right? It's centered more on God. And like in the back, this isn't this groundbreaking book. Stephen Ford argues that John Locke's devotion to modern science deeply shaped his moral and political philosophy, beginning with an account of the classical approach to natural and moral philosophy and of the medieval scholasticism that took these forward into early modernity. Ford explores why the modern scientific project of Francis Bacon, Pierre Gassendi, Robert Boyle, and others required the rejection of the classical approach. Locke fully subscribed to this rejection and took it upon himself to provide a foundation for a compatible morality in politics. Ford shows that Locke's theory of moral, quote, mixed modes, end quote, owes much to Pufendorf and is tailored to accommodate science. The theory requires a divine legislator, which in turn makes natural law the foundation of morality, rather than individual natural right. Ford shows the ways that Locke's approach modified his individualism and colored his philosophy of property, politics, and education. So that was an interesting book. That's what it looks like. This one is called Abraham Lincoln's Political Faith. This is by Joseph R. Forneri. Let me see what this is about. This is just at Gettysburg, Lincoln resolved that, quote, this nation under God, end quote, would not perish. And in his second inaugural, he called, quote, firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, end quote. How are we to understand these and other invocations of divine authority in speeches and writings of America's most admired president? Exploring Lincoln's unique blending of religion and politics, Forneri shows that Lincoln presented a comprehensive and compelling interpretation of political order founded upon American democratic and religious traditions. Pro-slavery theologians based their claims to legitimacy on scripture, but Lincoln denounced this position as incompatible with true religion, reason, and republicanism. He envisioned instead a united nation that would honor both God and American political principles. Forneri casts Lincoln's unique combination of politics and piety as, quote, biblical republicanism, end quote, emerging of Judeo-Christian beliefs that the founders traditioned of self-government. In a time of unprecedented crisis and upheaval, biblical republicanism provided Lincoln with a moral justification for difficult political choices. Forneri demonstrates the sincerity of Lincoln's belief and reveals the remarkable consistency between his public and private religious views. Though Lincoln's faith deepened during the turbulent war years and after the death of his son, Willie, continues says his articulation of this faith remained consistent throughout much of his life. Convinced that religion was a crucial aspect of life, Lincoln maintained that his own faith guided and shaped his political thought. In contrast to scholars who have emphasized the Lyceum Address as the key to understanding Lincoln's religion and politics, Forneri brings forth the Peoria Address of 1854 as a more profound and mature reflection of Lincoln's political faith. At Peoria, Lincoln invoked the Declaration of Independence and as the nation's moral covenant, characterizing the struggles over extending slavery as a clash between rival political faiths. He emphasized that the Union was worthy of preservation in light of the Declaration's principles of liberty and equality, and that these principles were best secured under the auspices of national union. Committed to the Constitution, Abraham Lincoln's political faith sheds new light on how the great emancipator's personal trust in a living God shaped his vision for a new America. That's good. And so, like this, that's Lincoln on the cover. It's actually a pretty nice looking cover. You can see it in person. Online, it just look kind of plain, right? We have another book here. It's about Lincoln, right? It's Harry Jaffa, Abraham Lincoln, and the Gettysburg Address. Prophetic Statesmanship by Edward J. Erler. I think the same author who wrote the book Locke, Property in Pursuit of Happiness, I think it was. It's also a good book. It looks like this. That's Lincoln there. And I think most of these books came out this year or last year. They're fairly recent. Like what it's about. And it says here in this flap, in Prophetic Statesmanship, Harry Jaffa, Abraham Lincoln, and the Gettysburg Address, Edward J. Erler presents the lesser-known late life scholarship of renowned Lincoln scholar Harry Victor Jaffa through a deep reading of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and second inaugural. Erler considers some of Jaffa's startling discoveries about Lincoln, Aquinas, Aristotle, and America's political founding, discoveries that sometimes seem to contradict Jaffa's own prior writing and often contradict the existing scholarly consensus. In 1959, Jaffa established himself as a foremost Lincoln scholar when he published Crisis of the House Divided, a revolutionary breakthrough in the understanding of Lincoln's political philosophy. But by the time Jaffa published A New Birth of Freedom, and he had developed a deeper understanding of what is known as the, quote, theological political question, and, quote, the conflict between theology and politics and philosophical thought. Jaffa referred to this development as his, quote, second sailing, end quote. Jaffa was never able to flesh out his evolving ideas about the, quote, theological political question, end quote, as it concerns Abraham Lincoln while he was alive. At the behest of Jaffa, his student Edward Erler wrote this book to do just that. With his own scholarly aplomb, Erler explores Jaffa's scholarship on Aristotle's presence in the American founding. Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Aquinas surprisingly shared, albeit concealed, vision of participatory government, the union of divine law and natural law in the American founding, and the primacy of prudence as supreme political virtue, among other topics. This is a book for anyone interested in the past and future of American political thought. I guess that's where that ends. So that book was about. This one is Christianity and the Political Order, conflict, cooptation, and cooperation by Kenneth R. Himes. Looks like this. It's like a kind of sort of a plain cover, kind of. And, let me see. It says, like in the back, it says, beyond electoral campaigns and government structures, the relationship between the political realm and Christianity has always involved the important questions of how we ought to live together and how we should organize and govern our common life. Himes notes that politics and the political choices we make must be, quote, guided by considerations of national and global justice and peace, and for Christians by the teachings of Jesus, end quote, as interpreted by tradition. Thus, Himes examines the relationship between Christianity and politics from the teachings of the Old and New Testaments throughout the patristic and medieval eras and the age of reform to the age of revolution, and through the 20th century into the third millennium. He addresses questions of the role of the church in politics, responsible voting, concerning concerns of globalization and issues of human rights and war and peace. And he gives suggestions of further readings. So it has a lot to do with Christian and political order. He goes over Old Testament, like as first part, biblical perspectives. Got Old Testament, New Testament. Before that, he has like an introduction and all that. And the second part is the patristic era, the medieval era, then the age of reform, age of revolution. And the third part, this is contemporary perspectives. It says the nature, purpose, role, and form of the state. I think there's a bunch of other stuff underneath that, and why the church is engaged in politics. This page says the church and domestic U.S. politics, and talks about Christianity and international politics. Then it gives that as a conclusion, right? That's what this one is. This one's kind of thick. This one's by John Darish. It's called Government by Consent. Looks like this. Has a quote from Ronald Reagan. It says, quote, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same," end quote, from Ronald Reagan. I think it's written by a Christian. He's like a Navy veteran. Let me see. There's a bunch of topics. On, let me see if goes over government by consent in the first chapter. In the second chapter, it's law. Third chapter, American history. Fourth chapter, grand jury and petite jury. Chapter 5, history of the sheriff. And chapter 6, courts. Chapter 7, it's got the first part, chapter 7, introduction, founding documents. It goes over all the founding documents and stuff. And then chapter 7, the second part is Declaration of Independence. It goes over all of that. And then the third part to chapter 7. Third part is the Constitution. Then he has a fourth part to chapter 7. It says Article 1, legislative power. And it has multiple parts to chapter 7. It has a 5 and 6 parts as well, and 7. The fifth part talks about Article 2, executive orders, or powers. Chapter 706, part 6, right? Article 3, judicial power, and then chapter 7, part 7, article 4, the states. Yeah, it's got chapter 7 is pretty big. Chapter 7 is it's got an 8th part, deals with article 5, amendments, ratification. Chapter 7, the 9th part, article 6, supreme law of the land. Chapter 7, Part 10, Article 7, Ratification. Chapter 7, Part 11, Amendments 15, 18, 19, 21, 24, and 26. And then Chapter 7, Part 12, Amendment 26, I think it is. Chapter 7, Part 13, Original Amendment 13. Chapter 7, Part 14, Original 13th Amendment. The original 13th Amendment. Chapter 17, Part 15, goes over the Bill of Rights. Chapter 7, Part 16, goes over the Federalist Papers Index. And it goes on to Chapter 8. The first part of Chapter 8 is Committeemen. And Chapter 9 goes over militia. Chapter 10 goes over Memorandum of Law. And Chapter 11 says two power structures. Chapter 12 is Committee of Safety. It's pretty thick. I'll probably just go over it later. Then this one, found another book on John Locke, right? This one's from Nicholas Wolterstorff. It's John Locke and the Ethics of Belief. It's just plain blue cover. It keeps the religious presuppositions intact, right? It's kind of technical, right? It's kind of technical. See if I can read the back, because it's black letters and a dark, cover. It says, in this important study, Nicholas Wolterstorff interprets and discusses the ethics of belief, which Locke developed in the later part of Book 4 of his essay concerning human understanding. After lengthy discussions on the origin of ideas, the nature of language, and the nature of knowledge, Locke got around to arguing what he indicated in the opening epistle to the reader to be his overarching aim, how we ought to govern our belief, especially though by no means only, no matters of religion and on matters of religion and morality. Professor Wolterstorff shows that what above all placed this topic on Locke's agenda was the collapse in his day of a once unified moral religious tradition in Europe into warring factions. Locke's epistemology was thus a culturally and socially engaged one. It was his response to the cultural crisis of his day. Convinced also that of genuine knowledge we human beings have very little, Locke argued that instead of following tradition, we ought to turn, quote, to things themselves, end quote, and let, quote, reason be your guide, end quote. This view of Locke, in which centrality is given to the last book of the essay, invites an interpretation of the origins of modern philosophy different from most of the current ones. Accordingly, after discussing Hume's powerful attack on Locke's recommended practice, Wolterstorff argues for Locke's originality and discusses his contribution to, quote, to the, quote, modernity, end quote, of post-16th century philosophy. I probably could have read this part over here, but here's some. Since the Enlightenment, there have been debates, at times heated, over the implications of critical thought for our understanding of religious ideas and institutions. Disciplinary boundaries have always mattered less to the debate than certain acknowledged exemplars of critical thinking. Locke, Hume, Kant, Marx, Feuerbach, Nietzsche, Freud, and Durkheim long ago became canonical figures, but the list of model critics has never been stable and continues to proliferate. Struggles against sexism, racism, and imperialism have all produced prominent critics of their own. Now, complicating matters further, the idea of critical thought is itself under attack. At the same time, many scholars are returning to religious traditions in search of resources for their critique of contemporary society and culture. Cambridge Studies in Religion and Critical Thought is a series of books intended to address the various interactions of critical thinking and religious tradition in this rapidly changing context. So the series will take up the following questions, either by reflecting on them philosophically or by pursuing their ramifications in studies of specific figures and movements. Is a coherent critical perspective on religion desirable or even possible? If so, what would it look like, and how might it answer charges of reductionism, relativism, and nihilism? Should it aspire to take the form of a systematic theory? What sort of relationship to religious tradition ought a critic to have? One of detachment, of active opposition, of empathy, of identification? What, if anything, is worth saving from the Enlightenment legacy or from critics of religion like Hume and Feuerbach? Where else should we look for guidance in critically appraising religious traditions? To pre-modern philosophers? To postmodern texts? To the religious traditions themselves? When we turn to specific religious traditions, what resources for criticizing modern society and culture do we find? The answers offered will be varied, but will uniformly constitute distinguished, philosophical, informed critical analysis of particular religious topics. And this is a list of books in the series is given at the end of the book. So I got a lot of other books. But move on for that. This one is another book on Locke. This one's called John Locke and the Problem of Depravity by W.M. Spellman. Just a plain cover, green, like this. Just goes over like his thought on original sin and stuff like that. So this book examines the religious thought of the philosopher John Locke, and in particular, it says, this book examines the religious thought of the philosopher John Locke, and in particular his understanding of the Pauline doctrine of original sin, in order to demonstrate his lifelong adherence to a view of human nature and human potential, at once deeply Christian in orientation and in large measure antithetical to many of the ideas of the 18th century Enlightenment. The author places Locke within the larger context of 17th century latitudinarian thought and links that broad church wing of the Restoration Church with a more general Protestant tradition on the important issue of human depravity. He challenges the widely accepted picture of Locke as a Pelagian exponent of salvation without the assistance of saving grace and without Christ's atoning sacrifice, and disputes the notion that Locke was an early champion of environmentalist educational theory and the infinite malleability of man. For Locke and for broad churchmen, from Jeremy Taylor to John Tillotson, who have been accused of denying original sin, ignoring the atonement, and preaching moralism, Adam's fall in paradise nullified the possibility of meriting salvation without divine forgiveness and assistance. According to Locke and his latitudinarian friends, education might serve to an effective counterweight to man's innate propensity to overturn God's laws, but it could never obviate the necessity of the Christian faith in the lives of Englishmen. Nor could it reduce the importance of the central drama in that faith, Christ's work of salvation. So this is where it deals with. And then this one is also on Locke. It's called Locke's Moral Man by Antonio Lillardo. It's like this. And let me see. This is Antonio Lillardo presents an original interpretation of John Locke's conception of moral agency, one that has implications both of his metaphysics and for the foundations of his political theory. Locke denies that species boundaries exist independently of human convention, holds that the human mind may be either an immaterial substance or a material one to which God has superadded the power of thought, and insists that animals possess the ability to perceive, will, and even reason, indeed in some cases to reason better than humans. Thus he eliminates any sharp distinction between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom. However, in his ethical and political work, John Locke assumes that there is a sharp distinction between moral agents and other beings. He thus needs to be able to delineate the set of moral agents precisely without relying on the sort of metaphysical and physical facts his predecessors appealed to. Lordo argues that for Locke, to be a moral agent is simply to be free, rational, and a person. Interpreting the Lockean metaphysics of moral agency in this way helps us to understand both Locke's overarching philosophical project and the details of his account of liberty, personhood, and rationality. So I thought it sounded interesting, so I bought it, right? Just as this. Then this one is The Right to Private Property by Jeremy Waldron. Looks like this. This is back. Sorry. This is the claim that private property is one of the rights of man is subjected here to a comprehensive and critical examination. Jeremy Waldron contrasts two types of arguments based on rights, those concerning historical entitlement and those concerning the importance of property for freedom. He illustrates this contrast with a detailed discussion of the theories of property found in Locke's second treatise and Hegel's philosophy of right. He also puts forward original analysis of the concept of ownership, the idea of rights, and the relationship between property and equality. Above all, the author shows a determination to follow through in good faith the arguments and values used to justify private ownership, and finds that these traditional arguments about property yield some surprisingly radical conclusions. I have this other book. It was like, I think the other book was on Locke on property equality or something. It's from Jeremy Waldron. Did find this little short book. It's from David Hunt. This is John Calvin's Tyrannical Kingdom, Geneva's Experiment in Christian Dominionism. Looks like this. Obviously, I guess it might be like polemical against Calvin, right? We're just in the back. Sorry if my throat is too dry. I did drink some water. I drank it all already. It just says like, this is from 1541 to 1549. A French theologian, John Calvin, attempted the perfect marriage of church and state in Geneva, Switzerland, determined to transform the city into a model of God's kingdom on earth. Calvin established numerous detailed, quote, reforms, end quote, as well as devising a system to police citizens through regular home inspections, questioning the residents on all aspects of their beliefs and practice. Historian Will Durant reports that Calvin even dictated, it says here, saying the allowable color and quantity of clothing and the number of dishes permissible at a meal, jewelry and lace were frowned upon, A woman was jailed for arranging her hair to an immoral height. Censorship of the press was taken over from Catholic and secular precedents and enlarged to speak disrespectfully of Calvin or the clergy was a crime punished with imprisonment or banishment. Fornication was to be punished with exile or drowning. Adultery, blasphemy, or adultery with death. A child was beheaded for striking its parents. In the years 1558 to 59, there were 414 prosecutions for moral offenses between 1542 and 1564. It says there were 76 banishments and 58 executions. The total population of Geneva was then about 20,000. So some of those who profess a, quote, reformed, end quote, faith today take Calvin's Geneva as their model and thus hope to Christianize the United States and then the world. Is any wonder that much of the general public accusing evangelicals of orchestrating a, quote, vast right-wing conspiracy, end quote, recoils in horror at such a thought? That's a question. Recoils in horror at such a thought. Many Christian activists with looser attachments to Calvin hope to force an ungodly American citizenry into godly living, but is such an agenda within the will of God? No one ever worked so hard at attempting to do this, nor for so long a time as John Calvin, whose, quote, righteous, end quote, judgment dominated the people of Geneva for 8 deadly years. And says, should today's Christian leaders continue to laud a man whose behavior was often so far removed from the commandments of Christ and the example of Paul? Should believers seek to celebrate and emulate Calvin's theology, which led his ungodly reign as, quote, Protestant Pope, end quote, of Geneva? That's what this book's about. I bought it because it's like give me ideas and like all these Christian nationalists, you know, they think we agree on like the same things when we don't. You know, we all have our own visions for the country being Christian. And so anyone that advocates for that kind of like theocracy or anything like that, you know, to me is probably going to lose the most support, because nobody wants to be oppressed by religious narcissists, right? Yeah, religious narcissism. Yeah, this one I have two books from Sagvan Berkovich. This one's called The American Jeremiad. It's a short book. This other one is called The Rites of Ascent, Transformations in the Symbolic Construction of America. It's like that. And what are these books about? Let me see. This is when Sagvan Berkovich, The American Jeremiad, first appeared in 1978. It was held as a landmark study of dissent and cultural formation in America, from the Puritan writings through the major literary works of the antebellum era. For this long-awaited new edition, Berkovich has written a deeply thoughtful and challenging new preface that reflects on his classical study of the role of this political sermon or Jeremiad in America from a contemporary perspective, while assessing developments in the field of American studies and the culture at large. And then Rites of Ascent. Let me read some of the quotes. This is I'm tired. I have his other book, The Puritan Origins of the American South. There's also all these other books that he wrote, and so, I mean, they look interesting. It's just hard to describe, like, what exactly is he talking about. This quote from Gerald Graff. This is called, "The Rites of Ascent maybe not only Sackvan Berkovich's most accessible book, but his most important as well. In it, Berkovich applies his massively influential earlier analysis of the Puritan Jeremiad, the Puritan self, and the ideology of American liberal consensus to a broader range of American literature and culture, superbly written and powerful in its sustained critique. The Rites of Ascent will be required reading for students of American culture." These are like different essays, I guess. A collection of his essays. So it's like that. It's pretty interesting. Then this other book is called The Reformers and Their Stepchildren by Leonard Verdun. This is Fighting Amongst the Brothers. This goes over the Baptist tradition, I think. Just like that, just plain cover. Like in the back it says, the Reformation was erupted in Europe in the 16th century, was a glorious exhibition of the power of God to keep His word and His gospel of grace before the world. Many have recognized that the Reformers were not homogeneous, nor were they pure and without sin or spiritual blindness in part. Most historians have described the most visible division amongst the Reformers as that between the magisterial Reformers and the Radicals. Verdun chose to call the Radicals, quote, "stepchildren," end quote. And this book is an insightful look at the divide between these two groups and the consequences of being blind to one's own personal traditions. It's mainly like a Baptist book or so. It's got like 8 chapters, a postscript, and biological sketch, and bibliographical and footnotes I mean. Sorry. The introduction starts off saying, before the Reformation was 10 years along, it had become evident that not all who were rebelling against the medieval order were of one mind and heart. And it's become apparent that within the camp of the dissenters there were deep-seated differences, tensions of such dimensions that a parting of the ways was in the making. It had become plain that the Reformers would as a result be obliged to deploy some of their forces to a second front. They would have to divide their energies between two opponents, Rome and the Radicals. From the outset, the Reformers realized that the opposition that was shaping up on the second front was going to be formidable, at least as formidable as the opposition from the side of the Catholics. As early as May 28, 1525, Zwingli, in a letter to Vadian, expressed the opinion that the struggle with the Catholic party was, quote, "but child's play," end quote, when compared with the struggles that was erupting at the second front. The openings of the second front affected the course of the Reformation very significantly. By way of reaction to it, the Reformers backed into a corner where they would not otherwise have retreated. The opening of the second front caused the Reformers to go back on their own former selves and made them swing to the right. This bending to the right, occasioned by the emergence of the second front, caused much that was latent in the earliest rustlings of the Reform to go underground, as it were, not to emerge again until much later times. No suitable name has been given for the second front. So a name that has gained rather wide usage is, quote, the left wing of the Reformation, end quote. This name, however, is less than wholly satisfactory. The term left wing is borrowed from the parliamentary scene and stands for the faction that wishes to go faster and farther than the center, and much faster and farther than the right. We would therefore expect a left wing of the Reformation to out Luther, but an examination of the record shows that the men of the left wing did not do this. In fact, we find them going against Luther and at very crucial points. I think there's an example. So let us take, for example, that very central doctrine of the Reformation, the doctrine of justification by faith, and its bearing on the place of good works and the scheme of salvation. In his haste to establish the doctrine of justification by faith rather than by works, Luther downgraded good works. The only place he had left for good works was at the very end, as a sort of postscript or appendage. Something that needed attention after salvation was an accomplished fact. We meet in Luther, to put it theologically, a very heavy emphasis on the forensic aspect of salvation and the correspondingly light emphasis on the moral aspect. Luther was primarily interested in pardon rather than in renewal. His theology was a theology that addresses itself to the problem of guilt rather than to the problem of pollution. There is an imbalance in this theology between what God does for man and what he does in man. It was the imbalance that caused Luther to collide with the Epistle of James. So the people of the Second Front showed from the very first a critical attitude towards Luther's disparagement of good works, that it did not go along with his one-sidedly forensic theology. They complained that, Luther throws works without faith so far to one side that all he has left is a faith without works, They suggest that Luther solidified was heresy, taken as it was taken by some to mean faith unaccompanied in this matter, which takes us to the very heart of the Lutheran vision. The men of the Second Front stood to the right of Luther, so much so that their enemies accused them of being, heaven stormers, and work saints, people who think to earn salvation by their good works. Surely this is not left wing. One could, with greater propriety, consider it at this vital point to be right wing. These men stood closer to Rome than to Luther in this matter. We do well, therefore, to avoid the expression, left wing of the Reformation, Another name that has come into quite common use is, the radicals of the Reformation, This name is similarly inadequate, for it likewise implies that the people of the Second Front were quite similar to the Reformers, only more headlong. But the difference between the Reformers and the men of the Second Front was not simply a quantitative one. The difference was qualitative. Although we shall be using the term, radicals, occasionally, we do so with the reservation that they were radicals, it is true, but they differed from the Reformers in kind, not simply in degree. Since the men of the Second Front have also been referred to as, the stepchildren of the Reformation, This is a much better term, and we shall be using it freely. This name is appropriate for two reasons. First, because the men of the Second Front were indeed treated as stepchildren, allegedly are wont to be treated. Second, because they were the victims of a second marriage. Later we shall point out what the second marriage was. We shall also, likewise, in its proper place, suggest still another name as a useful designation of these stepchildren. Those are all different names they called them, and a decent sized introduction. That's basically what it's about, though. Just the other kind of reformers. So it's like that. So that's all the books I wanted to show off that I bought recently. So if any one of these books, sorry if my light went off, but if you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you, and God bless.